In this video, I'm going to discuss a bunch of specifics about political oppression. The topics of this video will be the Soviet Union, fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, fascist Spain, North Korea, communist China, and terrorist organizations. I will then explain what you can do to prevent your nation from becoming oppressive. If you're watching the full episode on the podcast channel, all sections will be timestamped in the description. If you're watching on the Eclipse channel, make sure to watch all episodes to get the best understanding on this topic. I hope you enjoy, and if you have any criticisms, leave them in the description below. Alright, now on to today's podcast. The best way to understand why people fall for oppressive governments is to look through all modern totalitarian states. Let's start off with the Soviet Union. During World War I, the Russian Empire was losing the war against Germany. At the same time, the Russian economy was collapsing due to all ties with Europe being destroyed by the war. Vladimir Lenin and his assistant Joseph Stalin disapproved of the Russian Empire being allied with the capitalist West and believed that they should not be involved in the war. As Lenin and his Soviet Party began to become popular in parliament, he campaigned on democratic reforms. Riots started taking place all over Russia due to such a disapproval of the sitting government. By 1917, the Soviet rebel militia had about 200,000 members. As the government began arresting Soviet rioters, the militia led by Lenin overthrew the government and established the USSR. But not everyone was fond of the new government. Right-wing military members and rebels who were still aligned with the old government went to war with the Soviets to get their country back. In the end, the Soviets were able to crush this army and officially conclude themselves as the rulers of Russia. After 1917, the Soviets gained control of all media within Russia. The job of the new media was to spread propaganda against capitalism and for communism and totalitarianism. The Soviets made literacy the number one problem within education because they wanted as many people to read their newspapers as possible. Within a society with a 90% illiteracy rate, it would be a bit hard to spread propaganda with printed media. People were arrested for having private radios and replaced all radios with a copper wire radio that would only broadcast stations from the Soviet Union. This was to prevent any Western media getting into the Soviet Union and to play only Russian media and propaganda. The role of a journalist was not to give commentary on speeches given by political leaders, but just to broadcast these speeches to the public. Things got even worse under Stalin. To help recover the economy, he loosened labor laws and made it illegal to quit your job or even show up late. Stalin celebrated by saying that production of raw materials was up about 93 to 108%. Anyone who worked in a mine were required to work 16 to 18 hours a day, which came to be fatal for many miners. If you did not work 16 to 18 hours per day, you'd be sent to a concentration camp. 3.7 million people were arrested for having anti-communist, Stalin, and government beliefs. Any written publications had to be approved by the government to prevent any criticism. In schools, factory work was promoted to keep the economy booming with future generations. The death penalty was also extended to as young as 12 years old. All religious sites were closed down and religious leaders were killed. This was to prevent anyone from believing that anyone was above the government of the Soviet Union. This is what led to the justification of participating in the Holocaust with Nazi Germany during World War II. Stalin's paranoia got so bad that he began to execute anyone he thought was thinking against him or the government. This led to about 1.2 million people getting killed. The Soviet Union began to look outward during World War II, not just because they annexed a good portion of Eastern Europe alongside Germany, but they started to export their propaganda across Europe to try to gain more influence across the continent. After Germany stabbed the Soviet Union in the back, they and their Western allies invaded and defended Germany once and for all. After this, the USSR was able to annex the entire east half of Europe. The Soviet Union campaigned on turning its new satellite states into democracies. When election time came, all of the candidates favored the Soviet Union, and whoever won always got a suspiciously large percent of votes. All centrist writings were now banned to guarantee that everything published would be pro-government. Stalin even made a requirement for his picture to be hung in all public buildings. But after the Second World War, the younger generations learned to smuggle Western media into the country, and overall were more liberal than their parents. Stalin's death made things worse for the Soviet Union, as succeeding leaders tried to backstep a lot of Stalin's policies to make the Soviet Union look better within the West. The trend in a more and more liberal population and a slow shrinking in size government led to a weakening nation. This was because the people were less and less enthusiastic about their government, and their economy fully functioned on there being a massive central government. In 1991, the Soviet Union ended up collapsing after the government pulled the plug on themselves after the economy was very weak and a good proportion of the people were now liberal and were fleeing to Western European nations for a place to seek refuge from oppression. The question that is being asked is this: why and how did people in Russia fall for totalitarianism? Russia before the revolution was ruled by a king who did a poor job with keeping the economy strong and the people safe from invaders. The Soviets promised that after the revolution, that with democracy they would be able to fix everything that had been broken. Without there being any opposition or checks by the people, the communists were able to monopolize on politics and government. Without these checks, the party became the government and the government became the party. With no opposition, the communists were open to going as radical as they could without backlash. An overworking, almost fatal economy, regulated media, regulated speech, regulated ideas. All freedoms were taken away because the people put too much trust within their Soviet party. But it wasn't just the Soviets that ran a totalitarian government. Fascist Italy is another good example. Fascist Italy was again the result of the Great Depression. Benito Mussolini promised his people to restore Italy from its poverty and give the nation good character again. He did this by implementing fascism and totalitarianism. Fascism in Italy was founded on the basis of giving up individualism and autonomy to sacrifice yourself for the greater nation. Only people who claimed to be fascists and supported the government were given citizenship. Anyone who did not support the government were not considered citizens and were banned from seeking employment. These rules were also implemented to anyone who had Italian heritage outside of Italy, though this was almost impossible to implement because Italy could not ban people from working in other countries. Propaganda was also a huge factor when it came to ruling through fascism. All propaganda pictured Mussolini as the savior of Italy, a man to bring the people out of the oppression of the former government who was supposedly responsible for the Great Depression. In 1926, it became law that it was required to show pro-government propaganda before any movie showings. Unlike the Soviet Union, artists were not forced to only create propaganda, but they were banned from making any art that would depict the government in any negative light. Only members of the military and members of trade unions were allowed to vote. Elections were also restricted to where only men could vote. This made it so when election time came, Mussolini was able to get over 98% of the vote. Although the fascists were atheists, they did know that the importance of religion when it came to appeasing the public. With this, Mussolini agreed with the Vatican City and would recognize all religious practices practiced by the Vatican, not just in the city-state, but within all of Italy as well. The fascists also went to the extent of giving religious officials salaries and holding their positions. As much as I want to criticize the fascists, this is genuinely a really respectful thing to do. And for an evil dictatorship like fascist Italy, you would never see countries today like the United States, China, Russia, or Iran give up any land to give people independent representation. But this was about it when it came to actually giving a group of people a sense of freedom. In return, the fascists were given high approval by most Catholics within Italy. By giving Catholics a sense of freedom and acknowledgement, over 90% of Catholics ended up voting for Mussolini when the next general election came around. But religious oppression was not out of reach for anyone who wasn't Catholic. Mussolini made it law to where all Jews and Protestant Christians were jailed. The only upside for the Jews of Italy was that Mussolini did not like the idea of participating in the Holocaust. In an attempt to better education, Mussolini raised the age to where someone could stop taking education from 12 to 14 years old. He also implemented policy that would create mandatory attendance. He wanted schools to focus on teaching fascism. He was able to enforce these policies by restricting education to only government-approved textbooks. All teachers were required to be part of the Fascist Party, and lessons about the history of Italy were the main focus of education. Mussolini created social programs that would fund sporting events, libraries, and movie theaters. With this being popular with the public, Mussolini pushed Hitler to make a similar program. Hitler then created his Strength Through Joy programs. Now that I think about it, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz should probably think about changing their campaign slogan. Paid sick days, paid holidays, and state insurance, social security, and the 40-hour work week were implemented. Everyone was expected to celebrate Saturdays celebrating the fascist government, but this failed because most people wanted Saturday to be a day of rest. The military was put in charge of removing all political opposition. They were also put in charge of taking out the mafia, but once connections between the mafia and the government were discovered, the government declared that it had eliminated the mafia and ended the program. But because Mussolini was allied with Germany, the people were fed up with an oppressive government. The public decided to overthrow Mussolini. This is when Mussolini was publicly executed by the citizens of Italy. With this, in 1943, Italy decided to ditch Germany and become part of the Allies. Although the public hated Nazi policy, Nazi Germany was able to take over all of Italy that was not ruled by the Allies. This made it possible for Hitler to round up all the Jews in Axis-controlled Italy to be sent to concentration camps. In the end, Italy was fully liberated by the Allies and have full freedom today. Like the Soviet Union, in the state of crisis, people were desperate for a change in government. This is how Mussolini was able to become elected. He's able to restrict who could and couldn't vote, and created a government significantly more oppressive than the last.